They called her the Baron's prize, a girl with eyes like winter sky, in chains, worth more than gold. 4 brothers, 1 locked door, 4 nights of terror that would end in flames and screaming. But what Rosa did on that 5th morning wasn't just revenge. It was a reckoning that would erase the Whitmore name from Georgia forever. This is the story of how one woman's anger turned a plantation into ash, and how sometimes the only justice comes from the very hands that were forced to serve. But before we begin, I want to know how far my voice can reach. Please comment on where you're hearing me from right now. The June heat pressed down on Savannah's auction square like a heavy blanket. Rosa stood on the wooden platform, her wrists tied, her unusual blue eyes looking at the crowd below. At 17, she'd already learned that those eyes, passed down from some distant relative no one talked about, were both curse and treasure. Baron Whitmore walked around the platform like a hunter, his expensive boots clicking against the wood. His plantation, Willowbrook, stretched across 3,000 acres of top Georgia cotton land. He was known for his wealth, his cruelty, and his 4 sons who shared his desire for control. Untouched, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the square. Rare features, strong back, reads and writes. Rosa's jaw tightened. Her mother had taught her letters in secret, whispering lessons by candlelight in their cabin back in Virginia before they'd been separated and sold. That education felt like another lifetime now. Before continuing, I need you to understand something about the world Rosa was about to enter. If you want to hear more stories of resistance and survival from this dark chapter of history, subscribe and leave a like. These stories deserve to be remembered. The bidding started at 800. Baron Whitmore raised his hand immediately, his thin lips curving into a smile that made Rosa's stomach turn. 2 other plantation owners tried to compete, but when the Baron reached 2,000, they fell silent. Everyone in Savannah knew not to cross Edmund Whitmore. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Within an hour, Rosa found herself in a wagon rattling toward Willowbrook. The Baron sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. "You'll serve in the main house," he said. "My wife needs a new personal maid. But first, my sons will want to meet you." The words hung in the air like poison. Willowbrook appeared through the oak trees as the sun began to set, a massive white mansion with columns that seemed to hold up the sky itself. Around it were dozens of slave cabins, fields stretching to the horizon, and an atmosphere of carefully maintained terror. Delilah, the head house servant, met them at the door. She was a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her hair and eyes that had seen too much. When she looked at Rosa, something flickered across her face, pity mixed with acceptance. "Get her cleaned up," the Baron ordered. "The boys will be back from Charleston tomorrow." Delilah led Rosa through the mansion's back passages to a small room near the kitchen. Once the door closed, she gripped Rosa's shoulders. "Child, whatever happens in this house, you survive it, you hear me? You survive." "What do you mean?" Rosa whispered, though part of her already knew. The Baron's sons, Delilah's voice broke. "They think everything on this plantation belongs to them. Every single thing." That night, Rosa lay on the thin mattress in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling. Through the walls, she could hear whispered conversations between the other house slaves. Names floated through the darkness, girls who'd come before her, girls who disappeared or been sold away broken. She thought of her mother who taught her that knowledge was power. She thought of the stories of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner that traveled through the slave quarters in whispers. She thought of the herbs her grandmother had shown her, which ones healed and which ones killed. The next morning, Rosa met the Whitmore sons. James was the oldest at 25, already managing half the plantation's operations. Robert was 23, fresh from university with law books and entitlement. Thomas was 21, drunk before noon, and William, 19, had their father's eyes and none of his self-control. They circled her in the parlor like wolves around a lamb. Their mother, Constance Whitmore, sat in her chair pretending to embroider while her sons looked over their father's newest purchase. "Blue eyes," James murmured, tilting Rosa's chin up with his finger. "How unusual! Father always finds the exotic ones," Robert added, his breath smelling of whiskey. Baron Whitmore watched from his desk, smoking a cigar. "She's for all of you boys, a reward for your hard work. But there's an order to things. James first as the oldest, then down the line." Rosa's blood turned to ice. The room spun, but she kept her face blank, her eyes unfocused. A trick her mother had taught her. Show nothing. Give them nothing. That afternoon, Delilah gave her a white dress. "They like the ceremony of it," she said bitterly, "like it makes what they're doing civilized." As the sun set on Rosa's first full day at Willowbrook, James Whitmore came to her room. James entered without knocking, locking the door behind him. The oil lamp cast shadows across his face, making him look like something carved from marble and evil. Rosa stood by the small window, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles went white. "You should feel honored," James said, removing his jacket. "Father paid good money for you, more than he's ever paid for property." Property. The word hung between them like a noose. Rosa had spent the afternoon memorizing every detail of Willowbrook she could access, the layout of the main house, the locked medicine cabinet in the Baron's study where he kept laudanum and arsenic for the rats, the kitchen where Delilah and 2 other women prepared meals for the family, the back stairs that creaked on the 3rd step. When James reached for her, Rosa closed her eyes and went somewhere else in her mind, a trick her mother had taught her for surviving the unsurvivable. She thought of the Savannah River, of birds in flight, of anything but the present moment. Afterward, James straightened his clothes and looked at her with something between satisfaction and disgust. "Robert comes tomorrow night, then Thomas, then William. Father's orders. He paused at the door. Don't try to run, the dogs are faster, and Father's punishments are creative. Rosa didn't sleep that night. She lay in the darkness, her body aching, her mind calculating. She thought about the medicine cabinet, about the kitchen, about the fact that tomorrow was Wednesday, and on Wednesdays Delilah made the family's favorite dinner, braised beef with wine sauce. The second night Robert came with a book of law, quoting laws between violations, explaining why what he was doing was perfectly legal, why she had no rights, why resistance was useless. Rosa listened to every word, storing away his arrogance for later use. The third night, Thomas was so drunk he could barely stand. He smelled of bourbon and rage, taking out some unnamed frustration on her body, while mumbling about his father's disappointments. Through the wall, Rosa could hear the other house slaves moving about, pretending not to hear, because what choice did they have? By the fourth night, when William's turn came, Rosa had already begun to plan. William was the youngest and the cruelest, trying to prove himself to his brothers. He wanted to hear her beg, wanted tears, wanted the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. Rosa gave him nothing. You'll crack eventually, William hissed. They all do. But Rosa knew something William didn't. She knew that sometimes the only power you have is choosing when and how you fight back. And she knew that the medicine cabinet in the Baron's study had a lock that could be picked with a hairpin. She'd watched the Baron open it a dozen times while cleaning his office. The fifth morning arrived with thick clouds promising rain. Rosa woke before dawn, her body bruised, but her mind sharp as glass. She dressed in her servant's clothes and went to the kitchen where Delilah was already preparing breakfast. "How are you, child?" Delilah asked softly. "I'm surviving," Rosa said. "Just like you told me to." Delilah studied her face and seemed to see something there that made her straighten up. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Rosa said carefully, "that I'd like to learn to cook. Would you teach me how to make the family's dinner tonight?" Delilah's hand stopped over the bread dough. For a long moment, the two women looked at each other. Delilah had been at Willowbrook for 30 years. She'd seen girls like Rosa come and go. She'd buried her own daughter after the Baron's father had gotten done with her. "The braised beef?" Delilah asked quietly. "Yes, with the wine sauce." Delilah nodded slowly. "I suppose it's time you learned the family recipes. Come, I'll show you everything." That afternoon, while the Whitmore men were in the fields checking on the cotton harvest, Rosa stood in the Baron's study with a hairpin between her fingers. Her hands didn't shake as she worked the lock on the medicine cabinet. Inside sat bottles of laudanum, morphine for Constance's nerves, and a brown glass bottle labeled arsenic for vermin. Rosa took the arsenic bottle and replaced it with one containing sugar water. She doubted anyone would check before the next rat problem. In the kitchen, Delilah watched as Rosa prepared the wine sauce, stirring the pot with steady hands. The older woman said nothing, but when Rosa added a white powder to the mixture, Delilah turned away and began scrubbing an already clean countertop. Sometimes, Delilah said to the wall, God's justice comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the only way out of hell is through fire. Rosa kept stirring. Leave a comment with the phrase that kept repeating in your head after this chapter. The Whitmore family dinner always began at 700 sharp. Baron Edmund sat at the head of the mahogany table, Constance at the foot with their 4 sons arranged on either side. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead and silver gleamed on the white tablecloth. Outside in the slave quarters, people ate cornmeal mush from wooden bowls. Inside, the Whitmore dined on china worth more than a human life. Rosa served the first course with steady hands, roasted pheasant with herbs. Her white apron was spotless, her expression blank. She'd learned to make herself invisible in the way that all enslaved people learned, becoming part of the furniture, present but unseen. "The new girl is working out well," James commented, cutting into his pheasant. "Father, you have excellent taste in purchases." "She's broken in nicely," Robert agreed, reaching for his wine glass. Hardly fought at all by the third night. Rosa's jaw tightened barely noticeably, but she kept her eyes down as she returned to the kitchen. Delilah stood by the stove, the braised beef simmering in its wine sauce. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she spooned the meat onto the serving platter. "Are you sure about this, child?" Delilah whispered. "There's no going back once you walk through that door." Rosa met her eyes. "I died 4 nights ago. What walks through that door is just a ghost getting even." She picked up the platter. The beef glistened in its sauce, looking perfect, smelling perfect. The arsenic was tasteless and odorless, mixed thoroughly throughout. Rosa had ground it fine and stirred it in herself, while Delilah taught her the proper temperature for braising. The dining room fell silent as Rosa entered with the main course. Baron Whitmore leaned back in his chair, looking over his domain with satisfaction. His wife looked tired, her hands shaking slightly from the laudanum she took for her nerves. The 4 sons were already flushed from wine, their voices loud with entitlement. "The famous braised beef," the Baron announced. "Della's specialty, though I hear our new girl helped prepare it tonight. Did she now?" William smirked. "Maybe she's learning her place after all." Rosa served the Baron first, as protocol demanded, a generous portion of beef swimming in wine sauce. Then Constance, who barely looked at her plate. Then James, Robert, Thomas, and finally William, each getting their share of the poisoned meal. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Rosa asked, her voice soft and respectful. "No, that will be all. Wait in the kitchen until we're ready for dessert." Rosa curtsied and left. Behind her, she heard the scrape of silverware on china, the appreciative murmurs as the Whitmores began to eat. In the kitchen, Delilah sat at the small table, her head in her hands. "How long?" Delilah asked. "An hour, maybe less, with the amount I used." The 2 women sat in silence, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark time. Rosa thought about her mother, about all the girls who'd stood where she stood, about the thousands of people working fields and serving masters across the South with no hope of justice. At 7:45 they heard the first cough. At 800 shouting started in the dining room. Baron Whitmore's voice yelling for water, Constance screaming, the sons cursing and stumbling. At 8:15 the vomiting began. Rosa stood and walked to the back staircase. She climbed to the 3rd floor to the Baron's private quarters. In his bedroom, she found what she was looking for, the strongbox where he kept the plantation's cash. The key hung on a chain around his neck, but Rosa had watched him enough to know he kept a spare hidden in his boot. She took 500. Not all of it. That would have been too obvious if anyone survived to notice. Just enough to buy passage north and start over. Back downstairs, the house was in chaos. Constance had collapsed in the parlor. The 4 sons were doubled over in the dining room, their faces gray, their bodies betraying them. The Baron was on his hands and knees, blood and bile staining his fine carpet. Rosa walked past them all to her small room. She changed out of her servant's clothes and into a simple dress she'd hidden under her mattress. She took the money, a shawl, and nothing else. In the kitchen, Delilah waited. Go now before they realize. Head to the river and follow it north. There are people who will help. Look for the quilts with the star pattern. Come with me, Rosa urged. Delilah shook her head. I'm too old, too slow. I just slow you down. Besides, she looked toward the dining room where the sounds of suffering continued. I want to watch them die. Rosa hugged the older woman. Thank you for teaching me to cook. Thank you, Delilah whispered, for having the courage. Rosa left through the kitchen door as the grandfather clock struck 9. Behind her, Willowbrook blazed with lights, voices calling for doctors, for help, for mercy that would never come. She was halfway across the east field when she stopped and looked back at the mansion. The image of 4 brothers standing in line, waiting their turn to violate her, the Baron's satisfied smile, Constance's deliberate blindness, all of it burning in her memory like brands. Rosa reached into her pocket and pulled out the oil lamp she'd taken from the kitchen. She thought about Delilah's words about fire, about justice. Sometimes revenge isn't enough. Sometimes you to erase the very ground evil stood on. Rosa walked back toward the mansion with purpose in her stride and a lamp in her hand. If you believe that Rosa represents courage and strength, comment. She resisted. The stable was Rosa's first target. She'd passed it 100 times in her 5 days at Willowbrook, always noting the hay bales stacked near the entrance, the dry wooden beams, the way the building sat just close enough to the main house that flames could spread on a good wind. Tonight God provided the wind. Rosa poured lamp oil along the base of the stable walls, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The horses stirred restlessly in their stalls, sensing danger. She opened each stall door wide, giving them a chance to escape. The animals weren't guilty of anything except belonging to guilty men. The first match sparked to life. Rosa touched it to the oil-soaked hay, and fire blossomed like a deadly flower. Orange flames climbed the walls hungrily, consuming wood that had stood for 50 years in seconds. The horses bolted into the night, their terrified whinnies carrying across the plantation. Rosa didn't wait to watch. She moved to the cotton gin next, the building where enslaved hands had processed the crop that made the Whitmore wealthy. More oil, more fire. The dry cotton inside caught immediately, creating a fire that lit up the night sky like a second sun. Inside the mansion, the Whitmore family was too busy dying to notice. Rosa could see them through the windows as she circled the house, the Baron crawling toward the front door. James collapsed on the parlor floor, Robert vomiting in the hallway. Their faces were gray, their bodies shaking from the arsenic coursing through their veins. Constance Whitmore appeared at an upstairs window, her pale face pressed against the glass. Their eyes met for a moment. Rosa wondered if the Baron's wife understood what was happening, if she recognized the girl her husband and sons had bought and brutalized, if she felt any regret for the life of willful ignorance she'd chosen. Rosa lit the front porch. The dry wood caught instantly. Flames raced up the columns across the roof through the carefully maintained appearance of southern gentility. Inside, someone screamed. Rosa felt nothing, no satisfaction, no guilt, just a cold determination to see this through. The slave quarters were 200 yards from the main house. Rosa ran there now, the heat from the fires warming her back. People were emerging from their cabins, drawn by the smoke and light. Delilah stood in the doorway of the main house, watching the flames consume the parlor. Everyone out, Rosa shouted in the common area between the cabins. Get whatever you can carry and run for the river. The plantation is burning, and when the fires die down, there will be nothing left but questions. Go now while you can. A man named Joseph stepped forward. He was tall, his back scarred from whippings, his eyes sharp with intelligence. Did you? Does it matter? Rosa cut him off. The Whitmores are dead or dying. The house is burning. You can stay and be blamed, or you can run and be free. Choose now. The moment stretched. 50 people stood in the firelight, years of conditioning fighting with the desperate hope of freedom. Then Joseph nodded. She's right. Grab your people and anything you need. We head north together. Safety in numbers. The slave quarters erupted into motion. People rushed into cabins, emerging with bundles of clothes, precious photographs, tools. Mothers grabbed children. The elderly were helped by the young. In 10 minutes, the entire population of Willowbrook's slave quarters were streaming toward the river, following the North Star. Rosa watched them go, these people she barely knew but who shared her suffering. Then she turned back to the burning plantation one last time. Willowbrook was fully on fire now. The mansion's roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The stables were gone. The cotton gin was ashes. Everywhere Rosa looked, fire consumed the monuments to Whitmore wealth and cruelty. Delilah emerged from the smoke, her face streaked with soot. "They're all dead?" she said simply. "I checked. The Baron died cursing your name. His sons died begging for mercy. Did you give them any?" "No more than they gave us." The two women stood together, watching decades of oppression burn. Around them, the fields stretched dark and empty. Tomorrow, neighboring plantation owners would arrive to find nothing but ruins and questions. They'd search for the escaped slaves, of course. They'd form posses and send out patrols. But Rosa had a head start, and she had something more valuable than that. She had purpose. "Come with me," Rosa said again. "There's still time." Delilah shook her head. "I told you, child, I'm too old. Besides, someone needs to stay and tell what happened here. Someone needs to make sure people know that the Whitmores didn't just die in some tragic fire. They died because one girl they thought they'd broken decided she'd rather burn the whole place down than let them win. They'll hang you. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just an old slave woman who couldn't stop the fire, who couldn't save her masters. Who knows what white folks will believe." Delilah smiled grimly. "Go on now. The others are waiting at the river. Joseph knows the way." Rosa hugged Delilah one last time, feeling the older woman's bones through her thin dress. "Thank you for teaching me to cook. Thank you for reminding me that we don't have to take it forever, that sometimes the powerless find power in the most unexpected places." Rosa left Delilah standing in the glow of the burning plantation and ran toward the river. Behind her, the last column of Willowbrook collapsed, sending up a shower of sparks that looked like stars falling to earth. In the distance, she heard dogs barking. The neighboring plantation owners were coming to investigate the fire, but Rosa and the others were already crossing the river, already disappearing into the network of safe houses and brave souls who ran the Underground Railroad. As dawn broke over Georgia, nothing remained of the Whitmore plantation but smoking ruins and questions no one could answer. In your opinion, was what Rosa did necessary? 3 months later, Rosa stood on a Philadelphia street corner, watching free black people go about their daily business. She'd made it north through a combination of luck, determination, and the kindness of strangers who risked everything to help fugitive slaves. The journey had taken her through South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and finally Pennsylvania. She was free. Legally, technically, undeniably free. But freedom, Rosa was learning, came with its own costs. The newspapers had carried the story of the Whitmore plantation fire for weeks. Tragic accident claims prominent Georgia family, read one headline. Entire Whitmore line perished in devastating blaze, proclaimed another. Some articles mentioned that the plantation slaves had fled in the chaos. A few speculated about arson. But without evidence or suspects, the theory never gained traction. Delilah had been found alive in the slave quarters and questioned extensively. According to the reports Rosa read, the old woman claimed she'd been asleep when the fire started, had tried to help her masters, but been overcome by smoke. The white investigators had apparently accepted this story. After all, what could an elderly slave woman do against such a catastrophe? Rosa knew the truth. Delilah had watched the Whitmores die and then helped Rosa escape. The old woman had been her accomplice, her protector, her teacher in more ways than cooking. Rosa carried that debt with her into freedom. In Philadelphia, Rosa had found work with a Quaker family who asked no questions about her past. The Harrisons treated her as a paid employee, not property. She had her own room, her own wages, her own life. At night, she attended classes at a school for free black people, continuing the education her mother had started. But the nightmares came regularly. Rosa would wake screaming, reliving those 4 nights in her locked room at Willowbrook. She'd wake smelling smoke, seeing the Baron's face twisted in death, hearing the screams as the mansion burned. Her hands would shake, and she'd have to remind herself that she was safe, that the Whitmores were dead, that she'd won. Had she won? Rosa wasn't sure. Joseph and many of the other escaped slaves from Willowbrook had also made it north. They'd scattered across Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts, building new lives in free states. Sometimes Rosa would see them at community gatherings, and they'd exchange knowing looks, but never speak directly of what happened that night. It was safer that way. One Sunday afternoon, Rosa sat in a church basement attending an abolitionist meeting. Frederick Douglass himself was speaking, his voice filling the room as he described the horrors of slavery and the necessity of resistance. Rosa listened, her hands folded in her lap, her blue eyes thoughtful. After the speech, an elderly white woman approached her. "My dear, you have such an intense expression. Does Mr. Douglas's message speak to you?" Rosa considered her answer carefully. "It does. He talks about resistance and freedom. I know something about both. Were you enslaved until recently?" The woman's eyes filled with sympathetic tears. "How did you escape through the Underground Railroad?" "Something like that." Rosa stood preparing to leave. She had no intention of sharing the full story with this meaning stranger. Some stories were too dangerous to tell, even in free states. The Fugitive Slave Act meant Rosa could be captured and returned south at any time. Admitting to murder and arson would only make her more vulnerable. But as she walked home through Philadelphia's streets, Rosa thought about legacy, about what story would be told when enough time had passed for truth to be safe. Would anyone remember that the Whitmores died because of their own cruelty? Would anyone understand that Rosa's actions weren't just revenge, but justice? Back at the Harrison household, Rosa found a letter waiting for her. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Her heart pounded as she opened it. "Dear Rosa," it read, "I don't know if this will reach you, but I wanted you to know I'm still alive. They questioned me for weeks about the fire, but eventually decided an old woman couldn't have caused such devastation. I told them you ran in fear when the fire started, that I saw you heading north. I hope you made it to freedom. I hope you're building a life worth living. What you did that night reminded all of us that we don't have to accept cruelty as our fate. Some of us are still here, still fighting in smaller ways. But you, child, you burned it all down and walked away. That takes a special kind of courage. Use it well. Use it to build something better than what you destroyed. Your friend in resistance, Delilah. Rosa read the letter 3 times, then carefully burned it in her bedroom fireplace. Evidence was dangerous, but the words were now carved into her heart. That night, Rosa dreamed of fire again, but this time she didn't wake screaming. This time she watched Willowbrook burn with clear eyes, accepting what she'd done and what it meant. She'd killed 5 people. She'd destroyed property worth thousands of dollars. She'd broken every law white society held sacred. And she'd do it again because some evils couldn't be reformed or reasoned with. Some evils had to be burned to the ground so something new could grow. Rosa hadn't just escaped slavery. She'd struck back against it, showing that the enslaved weren't powerless victims, but human beings capable of resistance, vengeance, and yes, violence when pushed beyond endurance. The fire at Willowbrook wouldn't end slavery. Rosa knew that. The institution was too big, too profitable, too deeply rooted in American society. But somewhere in Georgia, plantation owners had to wonder if their own slaves were biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Somewhere, an enslaved girl facing her own nightmare would hear whispers of the blue-eyed woman who poisoned her masters and burned their house down. And maybe, just maybe, that story would give her strength. 6 months after the fire, Rosa attended a 4th of July celebration in Philadelphia. White Americans waved flags and spoke of liberty, while enslaved people toiled in southern fields. The hypocrisy was stark, but Rosa understood something most abolitionists didn't. Freedom wasn't given, it was taken. Sometimes with blood, sometimes with fire. Rosa touched the small scar on her wrist, a burn from that night at Willowbrook. She carried it as a reminder of what she'd survived and what she'd done to survive it. In another life, under another system, Rosa might have been a teacher, a writer, a mother. Slavery had made her something else entirely. It had made her a survivor, a fighter, an avenger. And as Rosa stood in the summer sunshine, surrounded by the sounds of freedom she'd earned through courage and fire, she made herself a promise. She would use her freedom to fight for others still in chains. She would tell her story when it was safe, and she would never, ever forget what it cost to escape Willowbrook. The price of freedom, Rosa had learned, was sometimes paid in ash and blood, but it was a price worth paying every single time. As fireworks exploded overhead, Rosa closed her eyes and saw Willowbrook burning one more time.